Sometimes a useful way to tell a story is to start near the end. In this case, the end came a few years after 1514. In 1514, before the end, Spanish conquistadores in the so-called New Worlds of the Americas began to enact what seems to us a strange, indeed notorious, ritual. Upon approaching a new place, they read aloud a document known as the Requerimiento to anyone within the sound of their voice. In either Spanish or Latin, the Requerimiento explained to the indigenous peoples, who not surprisingly usually did not understand a word, that the king and queen of Castile and Leon, part of what we today would describe as Spain, were their rightful rulers. In addition, although conversion was not required, the indigenous peoples will be required to permit priests to preach to them and teach them the Catholic faith. If people did not obey, the Spanish promised they would, quote, "as to vassals who do not obey and refuse to receive their lords," end quote, they would, quote, "make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses, and take you and your wives and your children and make slaves of you all, take away your goods, and do you all the mischief and damage that we can," end quote. We, of course, are outraged by the injustice of such a policy. What gave them the right? To begin with, the Spanish would have protested that the document had been created after serious debates as a way to protect the natives from unscrupulous men who had attacked and enslaved natives without any explanation or regard. Beyond that, in the Requerimiento, the Spanish tell us what gave them the right. Like the oft-imagined first contact with aliens from another planet, the Requerimiento explains, supposedly for the indigenous people, just how the world was created and how the Spanish had been made lords of people in the Americas. According to the Requerimiento, the Spanish had the right to rule the Americas because a pope, quote, "as Lord of the world, made donation of these isles and terra firma," end quote, to them. According to the Requerimiento, Europeans regarded popes as successors to the first pope, St. Peter, to be, quote, "Lord, King, and Superior of the universe." In a few years, the idea of a Western Europe united in some measure of respect for the authority of the Pope, in other words, Christendom, would seem quaint, maybe even ridiculous. In 1517, the German monk Martin Luther set off what would be known as the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation would destroy any idea of Christian unity, right down to the present day. The idea of a Christendom headed by the Pope would have seemed ridiculous to Europeans in the year 1000 as well. In 1000, popes were dependent on kings and emperors, not the other way around. As far back as Charlemagne, the Pope, and the papacy in particular, had relied on kings and emperors to protect them from barbarians, think Lombards and Magyars or Vikings, Byzantine interference, and even Muslim invasions in places such as southern Italy. However, there was no one to protect the church from its protectors. In return for their services, kings and emperors felt they had the right to appoint and depose not just bishops, but even popes. Clearly something changed between 1000 and the writing of the Requerimiento in 1513. We'll come back to that in a minute. Another striking aspect of the Requerimiento was the concern to preach and teach Christianity to the native peoples. Cynically, we might conclude that this was just another power grab, but let's think about that for a moment. During this course, we have already seen other empires deal with the issue of integrating subjects with differing religious traditions. For example, the Romans, before the adoption of Christianity, did not indoctrinate subjects in the worship of Jupiter or encourage conversion. They couldn't have cared less about what their subjects believed. Occasionally, the Romans were concerned that public rituals like sacrifices for the emperors were respected, but they were more likely to bring the worship of foreign gods back to Rome. Then we considered Islam. From the Pact of Umar, we know that the caliphs after Muhammad were often not eager for other faiths to have knowledge of the Quran. Both the Romans and Islam successfully governed people who did not adopt their beliefs. What was with the Spanish obsession to preach and teach Christianity to the mass of indigenous peoples in the Americas? Once again, in the year 1000, even Western Europeans would have considered this very strange. In 1000, as one scholar has put it, the church's, quote, system of salvation had been geared to benefiting clergy and those wealthy enough to finance monks to pray for them and perform the very heavy penances demanded of the sinful, end quote. It was more concerned with princes and nobles who supported and defended monasteries than with the souls and beliefs of farmers or the steadily increasing number of people living in towns. Before the year 1000, there were many dioceses ruled by bishops, but not so many parishes with churches where a common person might hear a mass, make confession, or take communion. Preaching was rare, and marriage was not yet widely recognized as a sacrament. No church weddings yet. After 1000, by the time of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, you read some of the canons, think laws, from that council, the church was, according to one writer, quote, doing its best to provide pastoral care in the everyday lives of its members, end quote. They were concerned to make sure that people received sacraments and learned about their faith. People at the time described society as divided between those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. The church had finally rediscovered those who worked. Numerous parishes were established to make sure that people in general could confess their sins and receive the sacraments, now including marriage. Some historians have described this as nothing less than a revolution. So why the changes? Why did popes gain in strength relative to kings and emperors after 1000? Why was the church more concerned with ordinary people? As I hope you have figured out by now, there is rarely a single cause for any historical event, and never an explanation that satisfies all historians. However, one important factor historians often consider is economic life. Did some change in economic life cause, or at least contribute to, changes elsewhere in society? In the case of medieval society, historians do detect significant changes. It's not that life was no longer centered around agricultural products. That fact had not changed since the Neolithic Revolution at the beginning of this course. However, between the fall of the Roman Empire and around the year 1000, rulers in Western Europe were unable to maintain power by simply taxing agricultural produce and trade. Instead, they provided handouts, usually in the form of land and often land gained through conquests, to local warlords. The warlords and landlords are the same thing. And these were the knights of the manors. By the beginning of the 11th century, in other words, around the year 1000, life began to settle down again. Migrations or invasions, as we discussed, by non-Christian peoples gradually diminished, and improvements in agriculture became widespread. As described in the textbook, people began to live in towns and trade again. As a result, more unified kingdoms began to develop in places such as England and France. Kings tried to take back power and privileges from the warlords. Likewise, the church began to protect itself from the kings and emperors that it had formerly relied upon. At the same time, the church was able to gain financial support from the newly discovered common parishioners. They collected holy taxes in the form of tithes. If economic changes are part of the story, they are not the whole of the story. As the church began to involve those who worked, In the scheme of salvation through newly created or defined sacraments, think marriage, communion, and confession, they soon discovered that those who worked sometimes acted on their own understanding and beliefs. Popular heresies described in your textbook and readings, such as Catharism, the Cathars were also known as Albigensians, or the Valdensians, emerged. All kinds of acceptable piety, think the Franciscans or Dominicans, pilgrimages, all sorts of things, became mixed with practices that the church considered either a danger to the souls of the faithful or a threat to their own power. If the church was determined to free itself from the control of those who fought, the kings and the emperors, it was likewise determined not to lose control of the institutions of faith to these newly discovered people who worked. Some historians have suggested that this is the dark side of the church's growing concern for all, its claim to rule what it began to call Christendom. The church declared that it was looking out for all the faithful, and to be fair, it began to teach and preach to all. At the same time, the church also began to define who the faithful were not. Some have described this as a persecuting society being developed. Those outside this Christendom who refused to accept the authority of the church, be they heretical Cathars, disobedient Valdensians, Muslims, homosexuals, or obdurate emperors, were liable to face an inquisition or a crusade. Remember, crusades were not used only against Muslims. This medieval Christendom is what we see near its end in the Requiremento. In 1514, the Spanish were describing the unified Christendom that the Church had sought to create after 1000. It is a world where the power to govern requires the approval of the Church. Spain has the right to rule the New World because it received approval from the Pope. Likewise, if they obey the authority established by the Pope, the native peoples of the Americas were to be protected and provided the means of salvation by the Church. It is a very foreign world from our own in many ways. But between 1000 and 1500, this was the developed culture of medieval Christendom.